Edward the Blue engine is one of the oldest engines on the island of Sodor and the Northwestern Railway, making him one of the most experienced engines to ever be. He's the one who started the franchise and the one who serves as the voice of reason. He can be the kind of friend that others can confide in and seek guidance from, no matter who it is. But he can also be the one who scolds those who act rude or act out of proportion. He is the one who will be there to lend a helping hand, the one to be willing to save those who were even rude to him.
"They all hiss me, sir," answered Edward. "They say tender engines don't shunt, and last night they said I have black wheels."
The one to do his best regardless of how old he is, and most importantly, being the one who never gives up, regardless of the circumstances. According to the official lore book on Sodor, its people, histories, and railways, Wilbur Audrey said that Edward was fought off to be a Furness Railway K2, who arrived in 1915 and was purchased by the NWR for being a shy steamer, undergoing rebuilds as the year go on, which led to him gaining a two-window cab design and being fitted with a Fowler tender. However, there has been some debate about its basis, with some claiming that Edward isn't exactly a K2 of the Furness Railway, and some arguing that he is indeed a K2. So today, I will be looking to both sides of the debate, looking at what arguments they have presented, and then drawing my stance on the way I look at this debate, of whether Edward is undeniably a K2 or not. I'll be using resources like the RWS book, lore notes, and any information from lore keepers such as Luke Ryan, who upholds the Audrey study, to draw where my stance is. Before I get started, I want to make it clear that this video is not made to convince you or anyone to like or dislike Edward as a K2. This is just me looking into both sides of the debate and then figure out where I stand on the question of whether Edward is a K2 or not. By all means, you're allowed to have your own opinions on Edward being a K2 or not, and that's okay. That's not my problem. Alright, let's get started. So the most common reason why some say Edward isn't a K2 comes down to Edward's overall appearance. In both the TV show and the book's illustrations, he is visually depicted to consistently have a boiler pitched high, a slope slab at the front of his running board, wider wheel arches, and a two-window cab design. But with the K2, it's shown to have an open cab, frames on the running board, and the boiler is pitched a bit lower. This was the crux of the argument for Edward not being a K2 in the Railway series, using the illustration as a resource because Audrey clarified some of them. Overall, this was a common reason for why Edward isn't a K2, suggesting Edward is more of a GNSR V, which has a similar boiler pitch to Edward's look in the books and the show, and does have a two-window cab design, which Edward has, or the LNER's D31, which has a similar boiler pitch to Edward and a similar cab shape, minus the one window, of course. Now, the reason for fans pointing to the illustration of the books, despite them being inaccurate, to justify why Edward isn't a K2 was because Audrey clarified some of them, writing a lot of what is perceived to be hogwash just to justify the way the engines look. Which, when you read this passage about Edward, which states, but has since been so much rebuilt at Croven's Gate as to obscure his origins. It is generally thought that he began on the Furness as one of the shop steward larger seagulls of 1896. Shop seagulls being the nickname of the K2s. You could say, with what he's saying here, he's making up hogwash, hence why some use this and the illustrations as a resource to justify him not being a K2 from the Furness Railway. Another thing that I guess some could say supports Edward not officially being a K2 from the Furness Railway is, as pointed out by Twitter user Edward Thompson, it is never stated that he was a K2 at all, but rather, as it states in the RWS book, it is generally thought that he began life on the Furness as one of their shop steward larger seagulls of 1896. This hints that it's unknown for sure if he really is a K2 or not. And I guess you could say that because it says that, it's up to interpretation if we believe that he's a K2 or not, which is a good point. The first reason some believe Edward to be a K2 is because of its higher possibility. Since Belt and Furness, which was under the Furness Railway, was next door to Sodor, and engines from both the Furness and Midland were likely loaned in 1915, as that was when the lifting bridge from Victorstown to Barrow was complete. Edward being a K2 seems more likely, as he himself is confirmed to have been on loan to the NWR in 1915. There's also a class like the Furness K2, known as the NS-1600 class, who were a class of full furrows that were built by shop steward. And just like Edward, they also have a closed two-window cap design, which with the existence of this class, it can be argued that Edward can still be a K2 even with a closed two-window cap design, since the NS-1600 from Shop Steward is pretty much the same as the K2, just with a different cap design. Another reason is because later down the line, Edward is indeed confirmed to be a K2 by both Christopher Aldrey, Robert's son, in his Reading Between the Lines, and Lord Keeper Luke Ryan. Keep in mind, Luke Ryan upholds the Aldrey study, which means he and those who help uphold it have access to notes and additional information that isn't fully out for the public to see, read, or listen to, so this makes him a reliable source. In addition, one Twitter user pointed out that since the iOS book is written like an actual history book, not everything will be 100% on itself, which is fair since understanding history means asking around and doing research. But the user also argued that Aldrey wouldn't have mentioned the K2 larger seagulls under Edward if he wasn't one. Where do I stand on this debate? Well, since it's confirmed Aldrey officially has Edward as a Furness Railway K2, I don't quite see how he could officially be anything else. After all, if Aldrey didn't intend Edward to be one, I don't think he would have mentioned that specific basis when discussing Edward in this passage. It's also worth noting that Barrow-in-Furness was next door to Sodor, and since it was under the Furness Railway's jurisdictions, it makes sense that during World War I and the Northwestern Railway's construction, the Furness would have some of their stock loaned, and this could include a K2. Regarding the illustrations, you may ask, but what about where he said Edward had many rebuilds to obscure his origins? Isn't he just saying that to justify why Edward looks the way he does in the illustrations, despite being a K2? Well, I guess you could argue that, but I don't necessarily think that is the case. Luke Ryan said that Aldrey didn't want to just tell kids and go buy the books again, nor did he have to tell them, oh, it's wrong, just ignore it. He never wanted to talk down to them, and wanted to give them proper answers, as if they are part of the conversation, hence why he wrote the iOS book the way he did. And since he confirmed that the illustrations aren't 100% accurate, I think this is more of him trying to work with the way Edward looks into the lore of the Railway series without having the illustrators like the Edwards or T. Kenny redoing the ones that Dolby did. To me, this is the same way with how he tried to work Henry into having a real-life basis. And even if, he did justify some of them, that proves that without his word, the illustrations have no weight to them. In regard to his rebuild, by the time the Northwestern Railway purchased Edward, nothing stopped them from modifying or improving his design. It's just like with the LNER by 1923. Once they absorbed the Great Central and gained ownership of the Robinson 8Ks, which they reclassified as 04s, nothing stopped them from modifying members of the class. At certain points in time, in fact, they modified members of the 04 by replacing some of the engine's bell-pair fireboxes and open cab window designs with either more round-top boilers and a closed two-window cab design, classifying these designs into subclasses of the 04, like the 04-4 and the 04-5. This proves that when a railway owns a certain type of stock, nothing stops them from modifying them. The logic I just explained here with the 04s and their subclasses applies to Edward after he was purchased by the Northwestern Railway. I think Edward being rebuilt by the Northwestern Railway despite being a K2 makes sense, and here's my thinking behind why. In the official lore, Edward is described to be a shy steamer by the Furness. Now this is interesting because as far as I've researched, no K2 is a shy steamer. However, going off on how Edward was in Edward's exploit, where his crane pin in his side rod snapped, forcing the side rod to lodge into his side, which got removed, and he had to function with one axle and kept going. Or when he saved James from being a runaway, and after doing so was in need of mending for his worn parts.
I'm proud of you, Edward. You shall go to the works and have your worn parts mended. Oh, thank you, sir.
If true, my theory is that during his time on the Furness, before or during the First World War, he was pushing himself really hard, constantly at work, and when the war started, causing the workload of it to intensify and maintenance being poor. Coupled with him being built in 1896, which may have played a role in this as well, he began to perform more like a shy steamer. When Edward was loaned in 1915 to help with the Northwestern Railway's construction and stayed when construction was complete by 1918 up to his purchase in 1921, he'd likely be constantly at work. Heavy goods trains which had materials on them for rails and sleepers, and the conditions during war, just like on the Furness, plus the lack of maintenance, weren't exactly nice, which made his shy steaming more prominent. And it didn't help that the Northwestern Railway didn't have the exact tools to maintain him properly during both war and construction. And yes, his old age wasn't helping him either. So when the Furness was contacted about Edward, they didn't have an issue with selling him off, and they didn't want a worn-out locomotive that performed like a shy steamer to come back to them. Since Edward was likely worn out, rebuilding him into an improved design or giving him new parts like a brand new boiler, for example, that improves boat performance and its overall condition would likely be needed to keep him operational, even if it meant he ended up looking different from what he once looked like. This is not a foreign concept, and it is possible. In real life, GNR Gresley A1 number 4470 Great Northern was worn out after World War II and likely didn't perform as well as he once did when it was outshot back in April of 1922. Because he was worn out, he was selected by the LNER superintendent to be rebuilt by Thompson into his A1, later A1/1, which improved both performance and conditions as he was able to cover more ground than he used to, and was more powerful than ever. This could also apply to Edward. After construction of the NWR and World War I, as well as the likely factor of low maintenance of course, he became so worn out, his steaming issues was more prominent than ever, and he could barely function properly in his old K2 shape, and had to be rebuilt to have the problem fixed, to ensure that he can perform tasks better than ever without issue. Regarding Edward's classification and designation, this may bring another question onto the table. If Edward was rebuilt into a design that looks different from the K2, shouldn't he be classified as something else? Well, my answer to that question is not really. The reason is because of what Luke Ryan says here. He'd still be a K2 though. It wouldn't be a whole new classification, it'd be a subclass. Much like the LBSCR donating rebuilds with an X. Stephanie, being a A1X, being rebuilt from the LBSCR A1. Edward would be a K2X, K2/1, or however the NWR denotes drastic rebuilds. Here, we get some insight into what Edward's rebuild is looked as. Edward after his rebuild is still a K2, but is also a subclass of it, because the NWR and those who partook in his rebuild at Crowman's Gate saw the rebuild more as upgrading him, rather than making him into a whole new engine. If my theory is correct, only the boiler and the cab were new parts. The rest of the K2, like the chassis, frames, and smokebox, are still intact, but were likely altered, cut down, or modified to fit into the new design. Most of the K2 entity is still intact, enough for him to still be a K2, but the new parts fitted onto him also makes him enough to be a subclass or modified member of the original design. It's no different with the Royal Scots and the rebuilt counterparts. Both looked so different from each other when you look at the way the boiler and smoke boxes are shaped. However, the rebuilt Royal Scots are still Royal Scots. They still kept majority of their original parts, but they also have the 2A boiler type that they were fitted with between 1943 to 1955, making it enough to identify them as rebuilt, which tells me that the rebuilds with the Royal Scots, just like with Edward, were seen as upgrades and a modified variant of the class, rather than a whole new engine. Lastly, my final point is that Wilbert Awdry, despite not being perfect or flawless, is the series creator, meaning his word is the final say, because he knows his world, his creations more than anyone else, and loves his universe so much, he wrote a whole book about it even when he made some imperfections. By the end of the day, his word is more reliable than, say, an illustrator like C. Reginald Dolby, who couldn't give two Scots about the books, and even said that they will fade away in the future. At the end of the day, I'd rather believe a man who loves his stuff so much when he tells me about it, rather than visuals from someone who does not care and would say stuff like this. At the end of the day, Edward is confirmed to be a Furness Railway K2 Larger Seagull, just heavily rebuilt and modified to make him better than he ever was when he was first outshopped in 1896. But to be fair, that doesn't mean everyone needs to like him being a K2, just because it's fact. And that's okay. I personally think that you can accept that officially he's a K2, but still have the ability to like or dislike that aspect about him. Regardless of the basis, I think we all love Edward as he is for how he was depicted in the stories he was told in regards to his personality and what his character is. At the end of the day, Edward is just Edward. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Feel free to like, share, subscribe, turn on the bell for notifications whenever I upload or premiere, and feel free to comment your opinions down below regarding the topic. Thank you, and cheerio.